Welcome everybody to our lecture today in the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies public series of lectures. And our speaker today is Dr. Daniel O'Connell. And Dan is a lecturer in RE at Mary Mackay College in Limerick. He holds a diploma in philosophy, a Bachelor of Divinity from NUI Maynooth, a Master's in Education and a PhD from Boston College. Now, Dan's research explores Catholic theology in the public square and the public significance of the Christian faith in a pluralist society. His research and teaching focuses on developing a public spirituality for social justice. And he's a founding member of GRACE, that's an acronym for Global Researchers Advancing Catholic Education. This is an international community of practice focused on Catholic education globally. He's been involved in shaping Catholic religious education in Ireland for many years through his co-authorship of the Grow in Love Level 1 programme for primary schools, as well as the Credo textbook series for post-primary schools. He's contributed to public debate on the place of religion and religious education in society through his academic research output, as well as public lectures, letters and features in national newspapers and media. Today, we're delighted to have him with us, and his lecture is on the title of Catholic Education on Rapidly Thinning Ice. A big welcome to you, Dan, and we'll hand over to you.
Lovely. Thanks very much for that, Trish. You're very good. Let me just try and share my screen here, and then we can get off a little bit more formally. Okay. So we're only a small group today, so please feel free to jump in. If there's something really that strikes you, just do kind of jump in, and then there'll be plenty of time for conversation near the end as well. Here's an outline of what I want to do today. I want to say something about the overall context of Catholic education, and then some of the challenges. So some of the external challenges to do with the curriculum, new curriculum being developed, the anthropology in that, religious education, ERB and ethics, and the issues around divestment, and then some internal challenges to Catholic education, particularly to do with the teacher identity and their own sense of being at home in a Catholic school, and then just a word about opportunities, which is to do with continual professional development. Let me ask you a question. What proportion of primary schools in Ireland are Catholic? So if you had a pen, or, you know, we were teaching children, we'd ask them to do a guesstimate for teaching maths. But have a little guess in your own mind's eye. How many are Catholic, okay? How many are denominational? So that would be, if you think of all the denominational schools in Ireland, Catholic, Protestant, Church of Ireland, Muslim, things like that. Okay, so what proportion, percentage-wise? What's the proportion of multi and interdenominational schools, Educate Together, Community National Schools? So we just try to have a sense of what are the figures in your own mind's eye around those. And then let's look at some answers here. So if you think of the Catholic, there's about 88%, 88.9% of schools in the state are Catholic. And then when you put the Catholic and the other religious traditions together, there's about 94, almost 95% of the schools in the state are denominational. And then when you look at the multi-denominational and interdenominational schools, the heading there is 148 schools. So a little over 4.7% of schools in the state are multi or interdenominational. And then what we've got as well, though, is the government plans to have 400 new multi-denominational and non-denominational schools by 2030, so in 10 years' time. And I'll say more about that a little bit later on. So it's good for us just to have a sense of the overall landscape as it is at the moment. So 88% of schools in the state, Catholic, 94, 95 denominational, and only 4.7 inter or multi-denominational schools. Okay, some of the external pressures. I want to say a word about these four things: anthropology in the curriculum, the place of religious education currently in primary schools, ERB and ethics, and divestment. So anthropology in the curriculum. So this is about what's the view of the child in the curriculum. So here's another guesstimate session for you if you have a pen and paper. What is the proportion of the population who are Catholic, Christian, religious, no religion, or atheist, okay? What's the proportion of the population? So again, if you think, how many Catholics, how many people who say they're Christian overall, sense of religious, belonging to a religious community, no religion and atheist, okay? Let's look at those for a second. So from the last census, 2016, about 78% self-identify as Catholic, about 3.5 million people. Total Christians in the country, about 85% of the population. That's nearly 4 million people would identify as Christian in the country. The amount of people who would be belonging to a religious tradition, whether that's Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Sikh, whatever that might be, that's 87%. So that's over 4 million people in the country belong to a religious tradition. And then those of no religious tradition, that number has grown. It's doubled since the last census in 2011. So it's almost 10%. And that's about nearly 500,000 people, 500,000 people of no religious tradition. What's interesting there, just to point out though, that this stuff, as you know, I'm sure, it doesn't run in a straight line. Because you don't have no religious tradition, doesn't mean you're actually a convinced atheist either. So a piece of research that was done with the Behavior and Attitudes Research Organization in 2016, they did a survey about religious identity of people in 2016. And there's in their survey, something like 14% of people had no religion. But of that 14%, 9% said they would consider themselves not religious, but I do consider myself a spiritual person. 9% of that group. So just because you don't belong to a religious tradition doesn't mean you're not necessarily spiritual in some way, whatever that word means. And then finally, in our numbers, are a percentage of people, 0.16% of the population are atheists. So over 7,000 people will self-identify as being atheist. So just for us to remember, I suppose, this figure, the vast majority of people in Ireland belong to a religious tradition. So that's 87% of people belong. And many of those not belonging, so that's that 10%, to a religious tradition, consider themselves spiritual. So when we look at the curriculum in 1999, it states the curriculum takes cognizance of the affective, aesthetic, spiritual, moral, and religious dimensions of the child's experience and development. For most people in Ireland, the totality of the human condition cannot be understood or explained merely in terms of physical or social experience. That was their sense in 1999 when this was published. Now, it's interesting to note in the consultation around the new curriculum, the NCCA, the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment in 2018, published an interim report called Consultation on Curriculum Structure and Time. And in that report then, there was no mention of the religious, spiritual, or moral sense of the child. It's interesting, there's those words, that sense of anthropology of the child who's been educated was absolutely absent. So from a curriculum that said you can't understand life in Ireland without appreciating these factors, 20 years later or 18 years later, there just was no mention of it. Now, that's changed a little bit. There was a shift 2 years later. We now have this draft primary curriculum framework, which is published, and that's the document that the NCCA are working off at the moment. And in that, when you compare it with the older curriculum, if you like, in the older curriculum, the spirituality of the child is mentioned 14 times. Now it's mentioned 4 times. The moral development of the child is mentioned 10 times, now once. Twice ethics, now 9 times ethics. 26 times religious, and 9 times religious now. Now, this is very broad stroke, and in a way it's a blunt instrument. But nonetheless, it gives an indication of the thinking of the NCCA. Initially, there was no recognition for the spiritual, religious, or moral sense of the child, and now there is some recognition of that. So the introduction to the curriculum in 1999 had that spiritual, moral, religious sense of the child, that there was this dimension of the child that needed to be taken into consideration in designing and teaching children. Now, 20 years later, it's a question. And the NCCA asks whether or not there should be a more extended statement within the redeveloped curriculum about the religious, spiritual, and ethical domain. So there's a huge shift, if you like, in tone or understanding in the curriculum. So it's a question now. But it's good to remember that the vast majority of people in Ireland belong to a religious tradition. 87% of the people belong to a religious tradition. And many of those not belonging to a religious tradition consider themselves spiritual. And yet the NCCA are asking the question if there should be a more extended statement within the redeveloped curriculum about the religious, spiritual and ethical domain, despite the fact the overwhelming majority of people in the land are religious. So that's a word about anthropology. Let me move on to the place of religious education. So the current situation is, in the current curriculum from 1999, it's a curriculum area subject in the area. So we have all the other subjects: language, maths, arts, physical education, SPHE and RE, and it's to be taught for a half hour each day. That's what the state requires in all schools. In reference again to the final report on consultation on the curriculum structure and time in 2018, it did away with religious education altogether. It was very strange because it named all these subjects, it named all these subjects: language, including language, maths, SPHE, SESC, arts education, physical education. But there was a subject missing, and they had removed religious education. So there was no explanation. There was no research base. It was just gone from the NCCA. Then below it, you'll see, including discretionary time, curriculum time, patrons program, in this thing of flexible time. The patrons program is in here, along with recreation, assemblies and roll call. You've got the patrons program, and that refers to what would have been religious education, if you like. So this is the first mention in the NCCA guidelines for the patrons program. So the problem here is that it's moving towards becoming a discrete subject, religious education. That was one of the recommendations from the Forum report on patronage and pluralism 2015. And that runs counter to the notion of an integrated curriculum where the subjects talk to each other. So if you're teaching religious education, you obviously can do geography, you can do history, you're doing maths, you can do English in lots of ways. So what's happened is, in that proposal, was that there was a separation of the patrons program from all the other subject areas. So if you like, there was a pendulum swinging here. So from 1965, the rules for national schools said, of all the parts of a school curriculum, religious instruction is by far the most important. Then in 1999, the curriculum, religious education, was one subject among others, simply one subject amongst others. Now, though, in 2020, is religious education a part of the curriculum? And that's a question now. So in the 2020 development from the NCCA, their curriculum framework for consultation, they outline a number of subjects to be taught. Now, so there's a shift in the thinking here from 2018 to 2020. So here's all the subjects, but now here's religious education. But it's called religious, ethical, multi-belief education, and also the patrons program. So they haven't got rid of the patrons program. So it's called religious, ethical, multi-belief education - patrons program. So it's interesting to hear Kieran and McDonough reference this. They say the contestation of former dominant perspectives has brought opportunity, yet as RE's hegemonous is challenged, its very existence within the curriculum is in jeopardy. So I think that's very true. It is in jeopardy. And I think that part of the problem is religious education has been associated with just religious instruction, or a confessional approach to religious education. And so there's a precarious place now. Will there be religious education into the future on the curriculum specifically? That's a question. Let me say a word about ERB and ethics. So ERB stands for Education About Religions and Beliefs and Ethics. In the document talking about ERB and ethics, it says, the NCCA say, it is widely accepted that knowledge of religions and beliefs is an important part of a quality education, and that it can foster democratic citizenship and mutual respect. So it's interesting. On the one hand, they're saying knowledge about religions and beliefs is important here, while also removing religious education from the curriculum, or at least the possibility of it. The NCCA consultation on curriculum for education about religions and beliefs and ethics showed a broad support for much of the learning included in their proposals. But that's a little bit misleading in the sense that what they don't say is much of the learning in ERB and ethics taking place already in religious education? That's not clear. And when that consultation was being done for ERB and ethics, there was a new curriculum introduced in education and a new religious education program introduced. So it's not clear that if any of the learning from ERB and ethics is already being contained in religious education. So now when we look at this proposed arrangement of subjects, ERB and ethics is going to be taught in social and environmental education and also in social personal values education here as well. So the problem is you've got ERB and ethics being taught here and religious education being taught over here. So if you like, in one school, you have, if you like, the children being exposed to ERB and ethics on one hand and Christian religious education on the other. And these train tracks are running parallel with each other, but not intersecting and not interacting with each other. And that's strange because the NCCA have just introduced a new specification for religious education at second level schools. So it's curious that they're pushing hard for the introduction of ERB and ethics at primary, while the subject's name at secondary is religious education. So the question emerges really is, what is missing in Christian religious education that requires a curriculum in ERB and ethics? What's not being taught there that the state sees as being important? Part of the reason or the value in ERB and ethics is for those who opt out of religious education, they need some sort of appropriate alternative. And that was signalled in the Forum Report on Patronage and Pluralism 2015, that what happens to children for 8 years who sit out of formal religious education. And one of the proposals was ERB and ethics for those children. But then the NCCA thought, well, actually, let's make ERB and ethics available to everybody, or at least insist that everybody takes it. Why is the state insisting on a religious education program, ERB and ethics, which it is, when there is one in so many schools already? What is ERB and ethics in distinction from Christian religious education? Also, a problem with ERB and ethics is there's a false separation between religions and ethics, as if there isn't a code or a morality within a religious tradition, and there is in all of them. So even the title of this subject is problematic. And also then even what ethics? So you're teaching ethics to children. What kind of ethics? Is it an ethics that privileges the individual over the community? Or is it a more communitarian ethic? So within the Catholic Christian tradition, an ethic that pervades most of its teaching is a communitarian ethic. And then you see the problem will be, what will parents want when presented with two religious education programs? When they realize, oh my goodness, my kids are being taught religious education in the subject called RE, and they're being taught it in ERB and ethics now. My goodness, that's a lot of religion being taught to my children. I think it's a bit of a Trojan horse, bringing ERB and ethics in as a separate subject to religious education. And it's a fragmentation then of religious education. Okay, last one of the external factors, divestment. This is very short. Just the fact is, as I said already, 89% of the schools in the state are Catholic. Only 78% of the population are Catholic. And that's not to say that 78% of the population would want Catholic schools. And then there's 9, or you could say 10% of the population have no religious, belong to any religious tradition. The fact of it is, there's just too many Catholic schools. And that raises problems for parents who'd rather their children didn't go to a denominational school. It's problems for children who'd rather not be in a Catholic school. It's a problem for teachers, because they may not share the view or the ethos or the worldview in a Catholic school and would be much happier and educated together at community national school, but because there's so few, they can't go there. So there's a question of integrity then. So when we look at all the schools in the state, we've got to remember this: the government now plans 400 new multi-denominational and non-denominational schools by 2030. So it's hard to see that realistically being realised. And part of the problem is that lots of parents are just by and large very happy with their local school, that there isn't the enormous groundswell of desire for change. So when you try to change your local school, it faces enormous opposition. But Nonetheless, that said, it is an issue and there needs to be less Catholic schools and more choice in the state. So I said something about the anthropology in the curriculum. I've said RE is on shaky grounds. I think ERB and ethics is a Trojan horse, and there needs to be some divestment of Catholic schools. Let me say a word about the internal factors that I think are probably even nearly more serious. So when we look at RE curriculum and the students are expected to teach this religious education program in Catholic schools. But the problem is, are there enough students graduating from colleges of education that actually want to do this? So when we look at the context again, 88% of the schools in the state are Catholic, 94 are denominational. You could look at the European Social Survey data from 2014. They'd say actually there's only 69% of people in Ireland are Catholic, but 94% of schools are denominational. So you can see there's a huge overhang. Question for us is, will there be enough teachers for Catholic or denominational schools when there are so many schools and not as many people belonging to that tradition? Let's look for a moment at the belief of pre-service teachers. Let me ask you a question. What proportion of a first year cohort in an initial teacher education program are Catholic? How many do you think believe in God? And what do you think is the proportion who attend a religious service at least once a month? So we're back to guesstimating. So if you have a pen, maybe just think of a cohort coming in, and say there's about 450, come into an initial teacher education program. What's the proportion are Catholic, believe in God, attend religious service at least once a month? So 94% say they're Catholic. But interestingly, only about 87% say they believe in God. This is from one of the years of research that we conducted in a college of education. So it's interesting, isn't it? How people would self-identify as Catholic, but not believe in God. And then of that group, of the people who say they believe in God, only about 30% believe in a personal God. And again, I think that's really telling in the sense that within the Christian tradition, a core belief in that tradition is that God is personal, that God reaches out and wants a relationship with people. But over 2/3 of them don't have that sense. They've the more vague sense of God, that God is a force or a power out there somewhere that's impersonal, but present, but impersonal. A little over half attend a religious service at least once a month. And from the data we could see, you could say that God is important in their lives. Many self-identify as religious and get comfort and strength from religion, but they're less confident in what the Catholic Church has to offer spiritually, but most especially when it comes to family, morality, and social problems. So this was a quantitative piece of research that was done in the sense of kind of clickers and yes and no answers. So it wasn't in depth. So again, it's broad strokes here, which is a blunt instrument. But nonetheless, you get a sense that the idea of the institutional church was one in which they didn't have much confidence. So the implication, 94% of all primary schools are denominational, where they are given horizons of significance. So within these denominational schools, there's a certain way of making sense of reality. There's a certain givenness to things, i.e. there is a God, and this God is personal. And this God calls us into a relationship and asks us to live in a certain way and how we treat others and live in relation to the environment. Such horizons are not and will not be shared, appreciated, or understood by 94% of graduating students. And this presents an issue of integrity then for the student who graduates from a college of education, who doesn't share, isn't hostile to this tradition, just doesn't share it. It doesn't make sense to them, doesn't help them make sense of reality. And yet the vast majority of schools have this characteristic spirit, and they're looking for a job practically, and they end up working in the Catholic school. They're a fabulous teacher, they're a fabulous person, they just don't share in this worldview. But it might be hard for them then when it comes to teaching religious education. And there's a question of integrity then for them in their own sense of self. And that's a problem. And nobody wants teachers to be in that situation. Because as we know, the best teachers are, Parker Palmer's thing. He's an educator. He talks about we teach who we are. We teach who we are. And the best teachers we know are the teachers who have a great sense of their own identity and who are full of integrity. So the problem for our teachers can be they're like a round disc in a square hole. They just don't fit, perhaps in the ethos of that school. And that's damaging for them, but also damaging for the school as well. A question then for the schools around internal factors: is religious education taught in Catholic primary schools? Now, there's not much research done on this, although I had a master's student last year and she said in one diocese, only 50% teach RE twice a week or less. So 50% only teach RE twice a week or less. So again, there's not reliable data on this, but certainly from conversation anecdotes, it's very rare you'd find a school that would teach religious education 5 days a week. And then the question will be, well, why is that? Is it curriculum overload? There just simply isn't time. And certainly some very good teachers would say that, just don't have time. And then for others, maybe they just don't see it as being a valuable subject. But again, we don't know, it's kind of speculation. So I think this presents an opportunity. If Catholic schools are to have a future, they need to address issues with the curriculum, for sure. But more importantly, they need the teachers and staff who appreciate their approach to education and to life. Because the curriculum as it is has religious education in it, requires it to be taught for a half hour every day, has language about the holistic development of the child. And still in all, it's hard to see schools where the intention of the school, the characteristic spirit, is kind of held by the vast majority. So I think one of the things that's absolutely essential going forward now is continual professional development for teachers. I was talking to a principal yesterday, and she said in her 30 years of being a principal in a Catholic school in Dublin, she never once has had any sort of continual professional development to do with characteristic spirit or religious education or the Catholic identity of the school. Nothing in 30 years. And yet the PDST do all kinds of in-service on behalf of the state for teachers. So it seems to me that the Catholic Church would want to really wake up to this if it wants teachers to have teachers where this tradition makes sense, not just to their heads, but also to their hearts. So there needs to be in-service for staff in a sustained, critical and conversational manner. And that's been done in certain dioceses throughout the country at the moment. There's a program being run in the Diocese of Killaloe at the moment, trying to kind of have staff talk to each other about the identity of their school in an adult conversational kind of manner. So there's a whole program here being worked out over a number of years that the staff begin to think about the identity of their school, and then I suppose their place within that. So let me begin to wind up this summary. So I've spoken about the anthropology, the kind of the lack of noticing or attention to the religious, moral and spiritual dimension of the child. I've talked about the precarious place of religious education and the curriculum. I've talked about the development of ERB and ethics and the absolute need for some divestment to happen very quickly. I've also talked then about the emerging mismatch between teacher identity and school ethos, and that's only going to grow. And I've talked about the essential place of continual professional development for teachers in Catholic schools, if Catholic schools are to have a future. So let me pause there and stop sharing my screen and then come back to the wider group. And hand back to Trish, if you're still awake, Trish.